Welcome! You're listening to the Uncharted Lancaster podcast, where we explore the hidden histories, forgotten places, and long-buried secrets of Lancaster County. Using modern digital storytelling tools, each episode brings a new piece of local lore to life, revealing the strange, the surprising, and the stories history left behind. Let's begin.
So, picture this. You are out for a peaceful Sunday bike ride in Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah. Sounds nice.
Right. You're on the Enola Low-Grade Trail. It is just a gorgeous afternoon. You've got families walking dogs. People are pushing strollers.
It's a totally idyllic weekend scene.
Exactly. And the path beneath your tires is crushed stone. It's perfectly flat, incredibly smooth. It's bordered by this lush, dense vegetation on one side, and on the other, you've got these massive, sheer, towering cliffs of solid rock.
Right, those really dramatic rock cuts.
Yeah, it feels serene. It feels like, a beautiful communion with nature. But what you probably don't realize as you're coasting along is that you were riding over a site where a mountain was literally blown apart by sheer brute force.
Yeah, that's the wild part.
You are pedaling right past a secluded, heavily overgrown hollow where, in a fraction of a second, 11 young men were completely vaporized in a blinding flash of yellow light.
It's a really jarring contrast, you know?
It really is.
Because we interact with massive infrastructure every single day. I mean, roads carved through impossible mountain passes, towering concrete dams, these beautifully reclaimed rail trails, and we just sort of accept them as permanent fixtures of the landscape.
Like they were always there.
Right. We rarely stop to think about the literal explosions, the blood, and the staggering human sacrifice it took to artificially reshape the earth like that.
And that is exactly our mission today. Welcome to our deep dive into the forgotten and, frankly, harrowing history of the Enola Low-Grade Railroad line.
And specifically the 1906 Shenks Ferry Dynamite disaster.
Yes. We have a fascinating stack of historical materials we are pulling from today to piece this together. We've got original 1906 newspaper clippings from the Lancaster Intelligencer and the Lancaster New Era.
Which are incredible to read, by the way.
Oh, absolutely. And we also have the personal handwritten diary entries of a man named Andrew Zurcher. He was a local undertaker from a small Pennsylvania village who actually had to deal with the aftermath.
That primary source is just so heavy.
It really is. Plus, we are looking at modern engineering retrospectives on what was, at the time, one of the most arrogant and ambitious railroad projects ever attempted in the United States.
It's really a story about the true hidden cost of American industrial progress. And to really grasp the scale of the tragedy that happened in that secluded hollow, we first have to understand the terrifying ambition of the Pennsylvania Railroad.
The PRR.
Right, the PRR, at the dawn of the 20th century. Because at the start of the 1900s, they were facing an existential crisis brought on by their own massive success.
Right, because the Eastern Seaboard was in the middle of this absolute industrial explosion.
Exactly.
You had steel, you had coal, timber, all moving at unprecedented volumes.
The Industrial Revolution was at a fever pitch. And the PRR's main line, which ran from Philadelphia out to Harrisburg, was completely choked. I mean, it was a logistical nightmare.
Because they're mixing all the traffic, right?
Yeah, they had passenger trains trying to keep tight schedules, while these massive lumbering freight trains clogged the exact same tracks. But the bigger issue wasn't just volume.
It was the geography.
Exactly. It was the natural topography of Pennsylvania.
The hills.
The hills. Pennsylvania is rugged. And the existing rail lines were plagued by steep grades, particularly outside of towns like Mountville and Elizabethtown.
Right.
Now, to understand why a hill is such a nightmare for a railroad, we have to look at the physics of steam locomotives.
Okay, lay it on me.
So a steam engine pulls massive weight by relying on the adhesion, basically the friction between smooth steel wheels and smooth steel tracks.
Which, inherently sounds slippery. Smooth on smooth.
It is. On flat ground, a steam locomotive is incredibly efficient. But the moment you introduce an upward grade, gravity starts pulling backward on thousands of tons of freight cars.
Oh, wow.
The engine has to work exponentially harder. If a track hits even a 2 or 3% grade, meaning it rises 2 or 3 feet for every 100 feet of forward distance.
That doesn't even sound like that much. 2 feet over 100 feet.
Right, walking it, you barely notice. But for a train, a standard freight engine simply cannot pull a fully loaded train up that hill.
Jeez, what did they do?
The PRR was forced to keep extra helper engines stationed at the bottom of these hills just to physically push the trains up to the top. It was bleeding them dry in fuel, labor, and time.
So the president of the PRR at the time, this guy Alexander J. Cassatt, he looks at this bottleneck and decides the only solution is to build an entirely new dedicated superhighway just for freight.
A massive undertaking.
Huge. They called it the Ackland and Susquehanna Branch, or the A&S. It would stretch from Trenton, New Jersey, all the way across Lancaster County to Enola, Pennsylvania.
Right.
But he didn't just want a new track. He issued a mandate to his engineers that, given the technology of 1903, sounds borderline delusional.
It really does. He demanded that this new line would have a maximum grade of 1%.
1%.
Yeah. The track could not rise or fall more than 1 foot for every 100 feet of horizontal distance. Furthermore, he demanded absolutely no curve sharper than 2 degrees.
See, I just have to stop and try to wrap my head around the sheer arrogance of that mandate.
It's hubris.
It really is, because nature does not build straight flat lines, especially not along the steep, rocky bluffs of the Susquehanna River.
Not at all.
It's like Cassatt looked at a topographical map, laid a wooden ruler across it, drew a perfectly straight, flat line, and just ordered his engineers to delete any mountain or valley that dared to get in the way.
Pretty much.
And before the invention of modern mechanized diesel earth movers, how do you even begin to force nature to comply on that scale?
Well, you do it by fundamentally erasing the existing geology.
Wow.
Yeah. To achieve Cassatt's flat line, the PRR had to fill in deep valleys to build them up and carve massive trenches through solid rock mountains to bring them down.
Just moving mountains.
Yeah, literally. In Providence Township alone, they hired the McManus Construction Company to dig cuts through the earth that reached up to 90 feet deep.
90 feet straight down into the bedrock.
Yes. In just that one 7-mile stretch, engineering records show they removed 1.3 million cubic yards of earth and solid rock. And over the entirety of the A&S project, they moved an astonishing 22 million cubic yards of material.
See, numbers like that start to lose all meaning for me. What does 22 million cubic yards actually look like?
Think of it this way. Just that initial 1.3 million cubic yards they moved in Providence Township. That's the equivalent of about 81,000 fully loaded modern dump trucks.
Oh my God.
Right. And if you took all 22 million cubic yards of the dirt, soil, and rock removed for this entire railroad and leveled it into a solid wall 3 feet high and 3 feet wide,
Okay.
that wall would stretch across the entire state of Pennsylvania. Twice.
Without modern hydraulics or diesel machinery.
Just unbelievable scale.
So if you can't just, ask a mountain nicely to move and you don't have massive modern excavators, what is the actual mechanism for doing this?
Brute strength. An ocean of immigrant labor and a practically unimaginable amount of volatile explosives. You're completely right to point out the lack of modern machinery. They had primitive steam shovels, but those could only scoop loose earth.
Right, they can't dig through rock.
No, to get through solid bedrock bluffs, they had to blast.
So let's get into the day-to-day reality on the ground, because the scale of the labor force is just staggering. In some sections along the river, they deployed over 1,000 men and 150 horses.
It's just a massive army of workers.
Yeah. And their primary tool wasn't a shovel, it was dynamite. Records show that in just one single month in 1905, they used 225 tons of explosives to blast away the Susquehanna River cliffs.
And we really have to examine the human cost of deploying 225 tons of dynamite by hand in a single month.
Because safety wasn't exactly a priority.
The concept of workplace safety was essentially non-existent. The absolute priority was speed. Cassatt wanted his railroad. So to move the rock, teams were using early compressed air drills to sink deep pilot holes directly into the sheer rock faces.
Wait, compressed air drills in 1905?
Yes, they built massive, stationary, steam-powered air compressor plants along the river. And they ran miles of heavy iron piping up into the hills to power these heavy, vibrating pneumatic drills.
That sounds incredibly dangerous just on its own.
It was. And once the holes were sunk, laborers would literally carry wooden boxes of raw dynamite by hand.
By hand,
Climbing up treacherous sheer cliffs and manually packing the sticks into the holes. They would wire hundreds of these holes together and detonate them simultaneously.
Hand-passing raw dynamite up a cliff face. That is terrifying. And if the blast didn't take the rock down to Cassatt's precious 1% grade.
They just dragged the air hoses back up, drilled deeper into the fresh, unstable rock face, packed more dynamite, and blew it up again.
Just brute forcing it.
Yet they repeated this until the ground was finally flat enough for the steam shovels and pickaxes to come in and clear the rubble.
It is a terrifying process, and the historical records show that the death toll was immense. I mean, premature detonations were shockingly frequent. Flying debris was a constant hazard.
The newspapers from that time are grim.
Very grim. If you read the local newspapers from that era, they are filled week after week with these incredibly visceral, horrific headlines. Things like, blown into atoms, his awful fate, or 4 men torn to shreds at Highville.
Wow.
These construction-related obituaries just became regular accepted features in the local press. All told, the Enola low-grade project claimed the lives of over 200 workers.
Over 200 lives just for a freight bypass.
Yeah.
And it is crucial to look at exactly who was dying. The demographic makeup of this workforce was highly specific.
Right.
The vast majority of these laborers were Italian, Turkish, Syrian, and German immigrants.
Yes, the historical accounts note that many of these men were essentially pulled directly from the incoming processing boats at the ports.
Straight to the work site.
Sent straight out to the blasting sites in rural Pennsylvania. And there is a deeply revealing quote from local historian Fred Abenshine about how these deaths were handled by the media and the company.
What does he say?
He noted that if you were a WASP, your death was reported with dignity. But when immigrant laborers died, they were just numbers.
Right. And just for context for our global listeners, WASP-AFISP stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, essentially the established, English-speaking, predominantly native-born American population of the era.
Right, the local establishment.
Exactly. The class and ethnic divide was absolute. If a local manager or a WASP foreman was killed, it was a profound community tragedy complete with a named obituary.
At the immigrants.
The newly arrived Italian or Syrian laborers, the press and the railroad company often didn't even bother to record their names. A premature blast would happen, and the record would just state, 3 Italians killed.
That is so cold.
They were treated as expendable cogs in the machine of progress.
So if this machine was literally running on expendable human lives and a seemingly endless, bottomless supply of explosives, a huge logistical question comes up.
Right, the supply chain.
Exactly. Where do you even get 225 tons of dynamite in a single month? You can't just put that on a bumpy horse-drawn wagon and ship it hundreds of miles across the country. It's too unstable.
No, you can't. The sheer volume required a localized supply chain. The PRR needed the dynamite manufactured as close to the blasting sites as physically possible to minimize transport risk.
Makes sense.
And that brings us to a highly secluded, heavily guarded ravine in Lancaster County known as Bousman's Hollow.
Bousman's Hollow.
Yes. It was geographically perfect for a powder company. It sits about 400 yards south of where they were building the railroad line, nestled deep between steep, heavily wooded hills.
So it's sort of boxed in.
Exactly. The logic was that it provided a natural blast shield. If an explosion occurred, the surrounding hills would theoretically direct the shockwaves straight up into the air,
Containing the damage.
containing the damage and protecting the surrounding countryside. This is where the G.R. McAfee Powder and Oil Company of Pittsburgh decided to set up a massive, dedicated dynamite factory.
Okay, let's stop and look at what a factory actually meant in 1906. Because today we hear factory and we picture a massive sterile concrete and steel building with mechanized robotic assembly lines.
Oh, not even close.
No, that is not what was in Bousman's Hollow. This was essentially a collection of scattered wooden sheds in the woods.
Right. If you stood on the ridge and looked down into the hollow, it looked more like a tiny rustic village.
Wow.
It was a settlement of simple frame buildings connected by dirt paths and a tiny narrow-gauge railway.
What's a narrow-gauge railway?
Oh, it's just a miniature train track with rails set closer together than standard trains, used for hauling small carts of materials between the buildings.
Okay, got it.
You had a storage house, a boiler house where steam was generated, a box house where workers hammered together the wooden shipping crates, and an old residential dwelling that had been converted into the superintendent's office.
Run by a guy named Albert Rapp, right?
Yes, Albert Rapp, a young but highly experienced superintendent.
And then, spaced further apart, you had the buildings where the actual chemistry happened. Which means we need to talk about the difference between nitroglycerin and dynamite, because I always assumed they were just 2 words for the exact same thing.
It's a common misconception, but the distinction is really the key to this entire disaster.
Okay.
Nitroglycerin is an incredibly powerful, highly unstable, oily liquid explosive.
Yeah.
It is so volatile that just a slight bump, a change in temperature, or even prolonged exposure to sunlight can cause it to detonate instantly.
Just sunlight.
Yeah, it is practically impossible to transport or use in construction safely.
Right, because you can't exactly hand carry a glass jar of volatile liquid up a cliff face while compressed air drills are shaking the mountain.
Exactly. So in the 1860s, Alfred Nobel invented dynamite. He discovered that if you take that highly unstable liquid nitroglycerin and soak it into an inert, absorbent material like diatomaceous earth, clay, or even finely ground sawdust, it stabilizes the explosive.
Oh, so it acts like a sponge.
Exactly like a sponge. It turns it into a moldable paste that is far less sensitive to shock, but still retains the explosive power of the nitroglycerin when intentionally detonated with a blasting cap.
So in Bowsman's Hollow, they are doing this entire process on site. The sources mention an isolated building where pure liquid nitroglycerin was manufactured.
The most dangerous liquid on Earth.
Right. Then that liquid was sent via rubber tubes down into a mixing house.
Yes, and in that mixing house, the liquid was combined with the absorbent wood pulp and chemical stabilizers until it looked, as one incredibly strange historical account describes it, like, quote, certain kinds of breakfast food of much more weight.
A heavy, highly explosive breakfast cereal. What a terrifying image.
Truly.
And from the mixing house, this heavy explosive paste was loaded onto those little narrow gauge carts and sent to the most dangerous building in the hollow, the punch house.
The punch house is where the volatile chemistry met intense physical manual labor. Inside this wooden building, workers would take the loose dynamite mixture from large bins, place it into pre-rolled paper tubes using metal funnels, and physically pack it down to make it dense.
Just pounding it in there.
They did this using heavy wooden stampers, or punches. Once the tube was densely packed, it was sealed, dipped in paraffin wax to waterproof it, and loaded into 50-pound wooden shipping cases.
Okay, but we have to talk about who is doing this manual tamping, because it wasn't a team of seasoned, hardened chemical engineers.
Not at all.
The McAfee Company employed about 40 people, mostly locals from the nearby rural village of Colemanville. The high wages drew them in, but they were shockingly young.
Very young.
The records show that in a building called the Shell House, located about 250 yards away from the punch house, the company employed a group of young teenage girls.
Kids, basically.
Their entire job was to manually roll and glue the paper shells that would hold the dynamite. And down in the punch house itself, the workers manually tamping the raw, explosive paste with heavy wooden blocks were teenage boys. We're talking 16, 17, 18 years old.
It is deeply unsettling to modern sensibilities.
It's beyond unsettling. They have teenage girls gluing paper shells and kids barely out of high school repeatedly slamming wooden blocks down onto raw explosives. It sounds less like an industrial factory and more like a high school shop class taking place inside the chamber of a loaded gun.
It really does.
How did they possibly justify this? Was there any illusion of safety?
Well, Superintendent Rapp reportedly stressed caution constantly. The workers wore shoes without metal nails to avoid throwing sparks on the floor.
Because even a shoe spark could be deadly.
Exactly. And to the company's credit, they had a streak of luck. For 2 full years, the Bowsman's Hollow factory operated at full tilt. They successfully manufactured and shipped thousands of tons of dynamite for the PRR low-grade line and the nearby McCall's Ferry Dam project without a single severe accident.
2 years is a long time in those conditions.
It is. But as is so often the case in industrial history, that 2-year streak of luck created a fatal, false sense of security.
Because they were surrounded by massive, glaring red flags. Just a few months prior, the entire county got a terrifying demonstration of what happens when explosive storage goes wrong.
Yes. On Friday, March 2, 1906, another powder house, this one operated by the Kerbach Construction Company, blew up near the town of Safe Harbor, just a short distance away.
Right. At 4:30 in the morning, 1.5 tons of stored dynamite detonated. And the description of the shockwave is unbelievable. It alarmed 1,000 square miles of the county.
People must have been terrified.
People 40 miles away in Glenmore were jolted out of bed because they genuinely believed they were experiencing a massive earthquake. People were running out of their houses in their night clothes, terrified the earth was opening up.
And the physical devastation at the site was absolute. A 59-year-old watchman named James Sweeney was killed instantly. The searchers found his body thrown 50 feet from where the magazine used to stand.
50 feet?
The force of the blast broke both his legs and drove a tree limb straight up under his jaw. The building itself was completely erased. The local paper noted it was, quote, blown to atoms.
Just completely gone.
There wasn't even a mark on the earth to show a building had ever stood there. The shockwave picked up a 150-foot heavy iron boiler and tossed it through the air like a toy.
And that was just the storage magazine at 4:30 in the morning. There wasn't even an active manufacturing floor full of people manually working the material. Yet the coroner's inquest just shrugged, decided it was an accident, attached no blame to the company, and the industrial machine just kept marching on.
The Sweeney explosion should have been a massive wake-up call that dynamite can detonate with incredibly little or entirely unseen provocation. But the deadlines for Cassatt's railroad were looming.
Right, the pressure was on.
So the Bosman's Hollow factory kept pushing out tons of explosive. Which brings us to a quiet Saturday afternoon, June 9, 1906.
It was around 12:30 p.m., just a normal, warm summer Saturday. Many of the 40 employees had just finished eating lunch and were heading back to their stations. Right.
It was so remarkably mundane that two little girls from Colemanville had actually walked down into the Hollow to bring a fresh lunch to their father, their two brothers, and their sister, all of whom worked at the plant.
Just a family visiting on a Saturday. Down in the punch house, 11 men and teenage boys resumed their work. Inside that specific wooden building, sitting in bins and packed in half-finished wooden crates, was an estimated 2,500 pounds of active dynamite.
2,500 pounds.
Now, we will never know with absolute empirical certainty what happened in the next few minutes because every single human being inside that building was killed instantly. But there are two prevailing theories.
Right. And the first theory comes from eyewitness testimony, because there was an inquest afterward, and an engineer named George Gray, who was working in the nearby box house, testified.
What did he see?
He said he was looking out his window directly into the open doors of the punch house. He saw a 38-year-old worker named J. Curtis Myers, who went by the nickname Klondike, stacking finished wooden crates of dynamite. Yeah.
Gray testified under oath that as Myers slid one heavy wooden box on top of another, a single spark shot out from the friction. Gray described it as, quote, just such a kind as a gasoline engine would send out.
A single rogue spark caused by the friction of wood scraping on wood, or perhaps a stray grain of sand caught between the crates. That is the immediate mechanical theory. But the second theory points to a much deeper systemic negligence, and it revolves around the terrifying industry 2-year rule.
I need you to break this down, because the idea that a building itself becomes a bomb is wild. What is the 2-year rule?
It comes back to the chemistry of dynamite. Remember, dynamite is volatile liquid nitroglycerin suspended in an absorbent material like sawdust, but it is not a perfect bond.
Oh, it starts to separate.
Yes. Over time, especially in hot, humid summer conditions, the nitroglycerin can begin to sweat or leach out of the sawdust. Furthermore, the daily manual tamping of explosives generates microscopic, highly explosive dust.
Aerosolized explosives floating in the air.
Exactly. Day after day, month after month, this microscopic dust settles. It falls between the floorboards. It gets ground into the grain of the wood by the workers' shoes. It seeps deep into the cracks of the wooden walls and workbenches.
That sounds like a disaster waiting to happen.
It is. Chemical engineers of the era knew that after about 2 years of constant operation, the physical structure of the building itself became hypersaturated with explosive material. The wood of the punch house essentially became a primed bomb.
So the walls and the floor were explosive.
Once a building reached that point, the slightest friction, a dropped wooden tool, a heavy footstep on a loose floorboard, a vibrating table could detonate the very room you were standing in. The standard safety protocol was to burn the building down entirely and build a brand new one.
And how long had the McAfee factory in Bosman's Hollow been operating?
Exactly 2 years.
Wow. And the historical records suggest the workers actually knew this. They knew the 2-year mark had passed, they understood the floorboards were sweating, and they had allegedly formally requested that management tear the building down and construct a new one.
It is unknown whether the McAfee company actively ignored the request to save money, or if they were simply delaying it to ensure they didn't interrupt the massive supply of dynamite required to hit the railroad's rigid construction deadlines.
They gambled with the lives of teenage boys to keep the supply chain moving. And whether the actual catalyst was Klondike Myers dropping a box or a saturated floorboard finally giving way under a heavy footstep, the gamble was lost.
It was.
At exactly 12:42 p.m., a time we only know for a fact because a shattered pocket watch was later found stopped at that exact minute on the remains of one of the victims, hell broke loose in Bosman's Hollow.
The explosion was absolute. The entire 2,500 pounds of dynamite inside the punch house detonated in a single simultaneous chain reaction. The wooden building did not just collapse, it disintegrated into microscopic splinters.
Just poof.
The flash of yellow light was so intensely bright, it burned the retinas of people looking in that direction from miles away.
The sensory details recorded by the survivors and neighbors are just visceral. You have to imagine the physics of a shockwave moving outward from 2,500 pounds of explosives. It super compresses the air, moving faster than the speed of sound.
It must have been deafening.
The roar was heard clearly up to 15 miles away. The concussion hit the earth so hard it registered locally like a severe earthquake.
And the physical environment in the immediate hollow was decimated. The sheer force of the blast wave sheared every single leaf off every tree in the vicinity. Huge, mature trees, as thick as a man's torso, were snapped in half like dry pipe stems.
Snapped like twigs.
The intense, instantaneous heat scorched the remaining splintered wood of the nearby buildings to a rusty, burnt color.
And a mile away out of the hollow, the damage was still severe. A local farmer named Jacob Sigmund reported that his entire farmhouse was suddenly illuminated by an eerie, brilliant yellow light that seemed to linger for almost a minute.
A whole minute.
The blast wave traveled a full mile, hit his massive, heavy wooden barn, and physically shifted the entire structure right off its stone foundation. It knocked it entirely out of plumb.
That's a mile away.
A full mile. The pressure wave ripped the heavy wooden window sashes completely out of the frames in his house. Closer to the site at Herman Gefhardt's house, his wife was sitting quietly sewing in a chair. The shockwave hit the house, shattered every pane of glass, violently threw her to the floor, and smashed every single dish in their cupboards.
Inside the hollow, the 11 men and boys in the punch house were vaporized. But what makes the physics of explosions so deeply unsettling and frankly terrifying is their capricious nature.
Right, how random it is.
Amidst the absolute obliteration of the punch house, there were miraculous, inexplicable survivals just yards away.
Yes. Let's talk about Superintendent Albert Rapp. He was sitting in his converted office dwelling working on the company payroll. He's relatively close to the punch house. The blast wave hits his office with such incredible force that it physically blows him right out of the building. But it doesn't just throw him through the window. It hits him so evenly that he is blown outside along with the entire heavy wooden window sash, and he survives with barely a scratch.
It's like something out of a cartoon, but it really happened. And up on the hill, in the shell house, 250 yards away, inside were 6 teenage girls gluing paper shells, along with the 2 little sisters who had just arrived with lunch.
Right, the little girls from Colemanville.
The concussion wave hit the building and knocked every single one of them violently flat to the floorboards. They were deafened, stunned, and absolutely terrified. But miraculously, the pressure wave didn't collapse the roof, and none of them were physically injured.
My favorite survival story from the records is the horse. The company had a draft horse trained to pull the little narrow-gauge material cars between the buildings.
Oh, the horse.
A young man named Lee was driving the horse, hauling a cart right out in the open. The blast goes off, the concussion sweeps over them, the horse panics, breaks its harness, runs blindly away, falls all the way down a steep, rocky embankment into a creek, and is found later totally uninjured.
Wow.
It's like the chaotic physics of a tornado that levels an entire house but leaves a fragile glass of water sitting untouched on a kitchen table.
It is exactly like that. But the most miraculous survival in Bousman's Hollow wasn't a person or an animal, it was the rest of the factory's inventory.
Right, because this is a fully stocked operational dynamite factory. They are supplying the biggest railroad project in the country.
Precisely. Sitting on the narrow gauge tracks right next to the flaming, obliterated ruins of the punch house was a wooden boxcar fully loaded with cased dynamite waiting to be shipped out.
Oh, no.
In the nearby storehouse, there were 2 more fully loaded boxcars of explosives. And somewhere else on the ground, sitting in heavy vats, was an estimated 7,000 pounds of raw, highly unstable liquid nitroglycerin.
7,000 pounds of nitroglycerin. And the blast from the punch house was so incredibly violent that the shockwave literally ripped the exterior wooden boards right off the sides of that nearby boxcar. It physically shattered the wooden shipping crates holding the dynamite inside the car, yet the dynamite itself did not detonate.
A state official investigating the site later told the press, quote, "There were sufficient explosives in the hollow to set a whole state in an uproar. If the shockwave had triggered that raw glycerin or those adjacent boxcars, the chain reaction would have leveled the entire valley, and the casualty count would have been unimaginable."
I just can't fathom the physics of it. It's like tossing a lit match into a fireworks tent, blowing the tent to shreds, and somehow none of the fireworks go off. How does the entire hollow not instantly chain react into a massive crater?
It comes down to the highly specific requirements for detonation. Dynamite requires a very precise velocity of shock to initiate the chemical chain reaction.
Like a blasting cap.
Exactly. The initial blast wave from the punch house moved outward with immense pressure, tearing the wood apart, but it lacked the specific, sharp, concussive trigger required to ignite the adjacent dynamite. The pressure broke the wood before the heat could transfer.
Wow.
But the survivors didn't have the luxury of pondering the physics of heat transfer. They were trapped in the middle of a burning, smoke-filled hollow, surrounded by unexploded bombs.
Right. You have to imagine the pure cinematic terror of the next few minutes. Men are picking themselves up off the burt. They are bleeding, dazed. Their ears are ringing with absolute silence from ruptured eardrums. The boiler house has caught fire. The storage house is burning.
Complete chaos.
And there, sitting on the tracks, right next to a roaring fire, is a splintered, broken boxcar full of exposed raw dynamite. These shell-shocked, injured survivors literally had to run toward the flames, put their bare hands on this broken, deadly boxcar, and manually push it down the tracks, inch by inch, away from the fire, just to save their own lives.
And once they managed the immediate fires and the threat of a secondary catastrophic explosion faded, the thick smoke began to clear. And the terrifying, gruesome reality of what had just happened set in.
That the punch house was gone.
The punch house was gone. There wasn't a timber left. And the 11 men and boys who had been inside it were gone with it. The community and the McAfee Company now faced a task that is difficult to even describe.
The search. Within a few days, the company pulled a large force of Italian immigrant laborers off the railroad construction gang over the hill. They handed them long sticks and empty wooden boxes and sent them into the dense woods of Bosman's Hollow.
To find whatever was left.
The way the Lancaster Intelligencer reported on this search in 1906 is haunting. The reporter noted that watching these men quietly scouring the underbrush and poking up into the high branches of the trees reminded him of, quote, chestnut gatherers.
Because they were looking for whatever biological material was left of their 11 coworkers. Because the blast was so absolute, there were no intact bodies. The human body is mostly water, and when subjected to a high-explosive vaporization event, it simply ceases to exist in a recognizable form.
It's just horrific.
The searchers found pieces of flesh and fragmented bone as small as a silver dollar, scattered over a massive geographic area.
A local man named Harry Burtsfield was searching the woods, and he looked up into the branches of a tree located a full 250 yards away from the blast crater. Lodged high in the branches, he found a human backbone and a couple of attached ribs. The concussive force of the blast had stripped the bone completely white and fleshless.
It's just, to truly understand the grim, heavy reality of this recovery effort, we have to look at one of our most intimate primary sources.
The diary.
The handwritten diary of Andrew Zurcher.
Yes. Andrew J. Zurcher. He was the local undertaker, as well as a merchant, in the nearby town of Conestoga. He was 49 years old at the time. And reading his diary is a profound experience because it gives you this incredibly stoic, mundane, day-to-day look at rural life in 1906.
Right, just a normal guy.
And it highlights just how suddenly and violently that peace could be shattered by industrial progress.
The contrast in his entries leading up to the disaster is striking. They're wonderfully, almost boringly mundane.
Tell me about it.
Wednesday, June 6th, he writes. Down at mill and at home, working in garden. Very warm all day. Thursday, June 7th. Went to Safe Harbor. Heavy thunderstorms. On Friday, June 8th, he actually travels to St. Joseph Hospital to handle the bodies of 2 men who were killed in a completely different, unrelated industrial incident.
Right, and he complains in his diary about how the bodies were, quote, not in very good shape because the hospital had left them laying without attention. So he is a seasoned professional. He is already deeply accustomed to dealing with the grim reality of crushed bodies and industrial accidents.
But nothing could prepare him for Saturday, June 9th.
No.
He starts the entry normally. Partly cloudy. Rescind deed for Mount Zion church property. He handles a standard burial for one of the men from Friday. But then the tone shifts entirely.
What does he say?
He writes, at 12:45, a heavy explosion took place, which shook the buildings here in the village, and a report that the dynamite factory near Shenks Ferry was blown up. I received word by phone to come there at once that 11 men had been killed.
And when he finally arrives at Bosman's Hollow in his wagon, this professional undertaker, a man who spends his entire life looking at death, is visibly shaken. He writes in his diary, on arriving there, I was horrified to find it only too true. The bodies torn to shreds, nothing recognizable. I brought up what was found, scarcely any more than what an ordinary man would make.
Scarcely any more than what an ordinary man would make. Let that sink in. He means that if you took every single scrap of flesh, bone, and tissue they painstakingly recovered from the woods over several days and combined it all together, the total biological mass barely equaled the weight and volume of one single human body.
It's just staggering. And here is a detail from the historical accounts that is just. It's almost poetic in the most deeply macabre, tragic way possible. Undertaker Zurcher didn't bring enough coffins because there was nothing to put in them.
Oh, yeah.
The sources state that all the recovered remains of those 11 men were gathered up and they fit entirely into just 3 empty wooden dynamite packing cases.
It is the darkest of ironies.
They died manufacturing dynamite to fuel the railroad, and their fragmented remains were literally collected, sealed, and carried out of the hollow in the very same wooden shipping cases they were being paid a few dollars a week to hammer together.
How does a tight-knit rural village even begin to comprehend a loss of this nature?
I don't know how they cope.
The psychological impact on the village of Colemanville was utterly devastating. Of the 11 men killed, 7 were from Colemanville or its immediate walking distance vicinity.
So everyone knew everyone.
Everyone. And these weren't old men who had lived long, full lives. As we noted, they were incredibly young.
It's important we read their names and ages to pull them out of the statistics. Fair Schaff, 18. William Funk, 18. W. Collins Parker, 16. John Boatman, 17. George Hathaway, 19. Joseph Rainier, 19. And Joseph's older brother, Benjamin Rainier, who is 23.
The story of the Rainier family is particularly heartbreaking, and it illustrates the generational reliance on this factory. The father, Martin Rainier, also worked at the plant.
He was there that day.
Yes, he happened to be outside the punch house when it blew. He survived the blast, though he was thrown violently, his right arm was broken, and he suffered a terrible bleeding laceration to his head.
Oh, wow.
The historical accounts describe him sitting in his parlor later that evening, completely covered in bandages, refusing medical comfort, not caring at all about his own severe injuries, but just weeping uncontrollably for the instantaneous loss of his 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin.
And remember those 2 little girls who walked down to the hollow with lunch baskets? They were Edith Rainier's little sisters. Edith was the teenager working in the shell house gluing paper.
Right, the whole family was there.
The lunch those little girls were carrying was for their father, Martin, and their brothers, Joseph and Benjamin. They were standing 250 yards away when their brothers were vaporized. And there's another story from the records that just gutted me, Fred Rice.
Yes, Fred Rice. He was a bit older. He was 25 years old. He left behind a young wife and 2 small children. And one of those children was just 2 weeks old.
During the search, laborers found a slightly larger portion of human remains in the high grass about 300 yards from the blast crater, right near the edge of the new low-grade railroad line. The grass around it was deeply beaten down, indicating it had landed with immense concussive force.
It's hard to even picture.
It was just a right arm, a portion of the upper torso, and half of a neck and face. Fred's brother, Frank Rice, was brought out to the site to try and identify it. And the only way he could confirm it was his brother Fred was by recognizing a very specific old healed scar on the severed wrist.
Because they could positively identify the remains of Fred Rice, the county coroner decided to hold the official inquest, focusing specifically on his remains, using him to legally represent all 11 victims. Undertaker Zurcher, because he was a respected local figure, was actually appointed to sit on the coroner's jury.
And when you read the transcripts of this inquest, the absolute coldness of it is staggering. They bring in Superintendent Rapp. He testifies that he has no idea what caused the explosion, but freely admits that careless handling of the wooden stammers could easily set the powder off.
And George Gray testified.
Right, they bring in George Gray, who testifies about seeing Klondike Myers drop the box and the spark shooting out, and after hearing that a 2-year-old wooden building full of aerosolized explosive dust and teenage boys pounding raw dynamite with wooden mallets exploded. The jury simply ruled that the 11 men, quote, came to death by accidental discharge of dynamite.
No blame whatsoever was attached to the G.R. McAfee Powder and Oil Company. It was ruled a tragic, blameless act of God, despite the open secret of the 2-year rule making these buildings death traps, despite the egregious labor practices.
The legal system completely absolved the corporation.
It did.
I want to contrast the cold, bureaucratic absolution of that corporate inquest with the deep, intimate grief of the community in Colemanville. On Tuesday, June 12th, just 3 days after the explosion, they held a mass funeral at the Colemanville Methodist Episcopal Church.
Andrew Zurcher, the undertaker, had to travel by train all the way to Harrisburg just to procure a solid, heavy metallic casket. Because it was physically impossible to separate the commingled remains found in the woods, 10 of the young men were placed together into that single, sealed metallic casket.
And Fred Rice.
Fred Rice, because his partial remains had been independently identified by his brother, was given his own separate casket.
The local paper noted that the church couldn't hold even a tenth of the people who showed up. The mourners spilled out of the doors, filling the churchyard and the surrounding cemetery. They buried Fred Rice in the morning service. In the afternoon, they lowered the single, heavy metallic casket carrying the other 10 boys into a large mass grave.
That's just so devastating for a small town.
Today, if you visit that quiet, rural cemetery, you will find a prominent, heavy granite block marking the site. The inscription at the top simply reads, "Our boys," and below their names it says, "In memory of those who met death in the explosion of dynamite, June 9th, 1906.
That granite block represents a deep, permanent, generational scar on the village of Colemanville. But while the village wept and buried its youth, the relentless industrial machine they died for did not miss a single beat.
No, it didn't.
The progress they were fueling marched right over their graves.
That is the most jarring, cynical part of this entire timeline. The dynamite those boys died manufacturing was being actively used to blast the cuts for the Enola low-grade line. The explosion obliterated the hollow on June 9th. Just 7 weeks later, on July 27, 1906, the Pennsylvania Railroad held a grand, triumphant celebratory opening for the completed railroad.
Yes, the PRR held a massive dedication ceremony near the town of Corryville.
Yeah.
They chose a spot they probably called the Deep Cut, which was one of those very ravines they had just violently blasted 90 feet down into the solid bedrock to create.
Right, where they used that dynamite.
Hundreds of wealthy investors, politicians, and locals gathered in their summer finery. A prominent local hardware dealer named George Hensel hoisted a silver-plated hammer and with 3 dramatic ringing blows drove a silver spike into the wooden ties to officially open the line.
A silver spike, a grand celebration. While just a few miles away, traumatized families are staring at fresh dirt on a mass grave. It is the absolute definition of the dark irony of American progress.
It is. But if we separate the human tragedy and look at it from a purely engineering and economic standpoint, the Enola low grade was an immediate, spectacular triumph. It did exactly what Alexander Cassatt envisioned when he drew that flat line on the map.
It actually worked.
It became a high-speed superhighway for freight.
Yeah.
It allowed massive trains to completely bypass the steep grades and tight curves of the older passenger lines, moving coal and steel to the coast at unprecedented speeds.
And the PRR engineers built some incredible space-age technology, for 1906 anyway, into this track to keep those trains moving as fast as possible without ever having to stop. It's a deep dive into the track pans because the physics of this blew my mind.
The track pans are a fascinating innovation of the golden age of steam. Steam locomotives consume a massive, almost unbelievable amount of water.
More than coal.
Oh, by volume, a heavy freight engine could consume 8 times as much water as it did coal. It is constantly boiling water to create the steam pressure that drives the pistons. Stopping a multi-thousand-ton freight train to fill up at a wooden water tower wasted precious fuel to break, wasted time to fill, and wasted massive energy to get the heavy train moving again.
And Cassatt wanted a superhighway.
So the engineers installed track pans.
Explain how these work, because it sounds like magic.
A track pan was a long, shallow steel trough, often a quarter-mile long, installed directly in the center of the rails, flush with the tracks, and filled to the brim with water. As the steam locomotive sped over the trough at 40 miles per hour, the fireman inside the cab would pull a lever that dropped a mechanical metal scoop down from the belly of the tender car.
So the train wouldn't even touch its brakes. It would just barrel over this quarter-mile trough, drop a scoop, and the sheer forward velocity of the train would force the water up the chute and directly into the train's internal tanks on the fly.
Exactly. The kinetic energy of the speeding train did all the work. The water spraying everywhere from the displaced pressure was reportedly an incredible spectacle to watch.
I can imagine.
And the infrastructure required to maintain this was massive. Because they operated in Pennsylvania winters, the PR had to build dedicated coal-fired boiler houses next to the tracks just to pump live steam into the underground pipes, heating the track pans so the water wouldn't freeze solid in January.
They heated a quarter-mile of water outside in winter.
They did. They even created an entire subsidiary corporate entity, the Octorara Water Company, solely to manage the reservoirs and pipe networks required to feed the estimated 2 million gallons of water a day these passing trains violently scooped up.
And we haven't even mentioned the bridges. To maintain that strict 1% grade when they had to cross the Conestoga River near Safe Harbor, they brought in the Kerbau Construction Company.
The same company.
The exact same company whose Powder magazine blew up and killed James Sweeney a few months prior. During the construction, a flood washed out an older, low-stone bridge on the river. So instead of just rebuilding the low bridge, the engineers built a massive dual-level steel viaduct, the Safe Harbor Trestle.
A massive structure.
It carried the old rail line lower down, and the new Enola low grade ran parallel to it, but soaring 150 feet higher up in the air.
It was an engineering marvel, and the line absolutely flourished. It hit its operational peak around 1941 during the massive industrial buildup for World War II. At that time, the average freight train rumbling over the A&S was 89 cars long, stretching almost 4,000 feet of solid steel and cargo.
Wow.
And the PRR didn't stop innovating. In the 1930s, the massive Safe Harbor hydroelectric dam was constructed on the Susquehanna River right next to the rail line.
And the PRR saw all that cheap, abundant electricity being generated right next door and decided to upgrade. By 1938, they fully electrified the Enola low grade. They transitioned away from the massive, dirty steam locomotives and track pans and moved to sleek electric locomotives.
Yes, they installed a massive network of overhead catenary wires.
For those who aren't train buffs, what exactly is a catenary wire system?
It is the complex web of high-voltage electrical wires suspended high above the tracks. The electric locomotives have a folding metal arm on their roof called a pantograph. This arm reaches up, constantly presses against the electrified catenary wire overhead, and draws massive amounts of electrical current down into the train's motors as it moves.
It's just brilliant engineering.
It was cleaner, faster, and highly efficient. By the 1940s, it seemed like Cassatt's flat, electrified superhighway would dominate the American landscape forever.
But the relentless march of technology and economics is ruthless. It doesn't care about the blood spilled to build it. After World War II, the golden age of railroads nationwide began a slow terminal decline.
Exactly. The federal government began heavily subsidizing the interstate highway system, and commercial trucking became faster, cheaper, and more flexible than rail freight.
Right. And eventually, this incredible, impossible railroad just became redundant. In the 1970s, overall rail traffic diminished severely, and the freight that was left was routed to other, more modernized lines. The newly formed Conrail took over the decaying PRR assets in 1976 and immediately started downgrading the A&S.
They shut off the power.
They tore down the miles of overhead electrical catenary wires to sell for scrap copper. And then the final blow. Just 82 years after George Hensel proudly drove that silver spike into the deep cut, the very last train rolled over the A&S line on December 19, 1988. By 1990, the physical steel tracks were ripped right out of the ground.
Bone.
Let's just pause and look at the sheer math of this endeavor. The Pennsylvania Railroad moved 22 million cubic yards of earth. They fundamentally altered the geology of a state. They spent $19.5 million in 1903 money, which translates to well over $500 million today.
That's a huge investment.
They sacrificed over 200 human lives, including the immigrant laborers whose names were never recorded and the teenage boys blown to atoms in Bousman's Hollow. And this world-changing railroad only operated for 82 years. Looking back at the staggering scale of the blood, the treasure, and the grief spent, was this progress actually worth it? Or was it just a monument to corporate hubris?
It is the ultimate unanswerable question of industrial history. On one hand, you can argue that for 82 years, that line was the vital, beating artery of the American economy. It moved the coal, the steel, the fuel, and the food that powered the eastern seaboard through 2 world wars and an unprecedented era of economic boom.
That's true.
It shifted massive amounts of heavy freight off the passenger lines, fundamentally shaping the region's prosperity. The sheer economic impact of the goods that traveled over that 1% grade is incalculable.
And on the other hand, 200 lives, the erasure of entire valleys, the mass grave in Colemanville.
Right. And that complex legacy brings us full circle to what that specific landscape looks like today. Because after Conrail ripped the steel tracks out of the crushed stone ballast in 1990, nature immediately began to aggressively reclaim those industrial scars. For 20 years, the flat right-of-way was swallowed by heavy brush, saplings, and dense vegetation.
But then the land gets a beautiful second life. In July 2008, the Norfolk Southern Railway, which had acquired the abandoned property, struck a deal. They sold the right-of-way to the 7 local Lancaster County townships it passes through, and the price. They sold it for exactly $1 per township.
$1.
Plus, the railroad threw in a couple $1 million for bridge repairs just to get it off their liability books.
And those local townships took that land and transformed the ruins of the PRR superhighway into the Enola low-grade trail. Nearly 29 miles of beautifully scenic, protected hiking and biking paths. Because Alexander Cassatt ruthlessly demanded a grade no steeper than 1% in 1903, modern Sunday bicyclists get to enjoy an incredibly gentle, smooth, completely flat ride right through the middle of the rugged Pennsylvania hills.
It is surreal. It's exactly like wandering through ancient Roman ruins, marveling at aqueducts or roads, except this wasn't built millennia ago by an ancient empire in togas. This was violently carved out just over a century ago by teenagers and newly arrived immigrants using steam drills and unstable dynamite.
It wasn't that long ago.
When you walk on that crushed stone, you are literally walking on the dust of their sacrifice. When you walk over the massive safe harbor trestle today, which the townships just spent millions to beautifully restore and reopen for pedestrians in 2022, you are standing 150 feet in the air. You are looking down at the sparkling water, enjoying a cool breeze, but you are suspended on a steel structure that was paid for by men who were blown to atoms.
And if you were riding on that trail today and you decide to step off the main path, walk down a steep wooded hill into Grub Run, and wind your way to the secluded depths of Ballsman's Hollow, you will find that the violence of 1906 is almost entirely masked by heavy woods, ferns, and a babbling creek. The earth has healed.
Nature always wins.
It does. But if you look very closely, down in a depression between the hills, you will find a small, easily missed iron sign painted black. It was quietly erected there by a dedicated local resident named Tom Grassel, who refused to let the site be forgotten by time. The sign simply reads, "Site of the Dynamite Factory Explosion."
Grassel was interviewed about why he put it there, and he just said, if I don't go down there and mark it, nobody's going to ever know where it is.
And that perfectly encapsulates the dual nature of the spaces we inhabit. The peace and beauty we enjoy today is inextricably, permanently linked to the brutality and sacrifice of the past.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive today. We started with the impossible, arrogant ambition of a railroad empire drawing straight lines through solid mountains. We descended into the terrifying chemical reality of early dynamite manufacturing, where teenage boys manually tamped raw explosives in wooden rooms saturated with volatile dust.
We walked through the heart-stopping, capricious physics of the June 9, 1906 tragedy.
Right, reading the stoic, heartbroken words of a local undertaker collecting fragments of his neighbors. And finally, we returned to the quiet, reclaimed hiking trails of today, where the deafening roar of that 12.42 p.m. blast has been slowly replaced by the gentle sound of bicycle tires on crushed stone.
It is a profound, deeply moving transition, from an industrial slaughterhouse to a peaceful sanctuary. But the history remains permanently buried right beneath the surface. And I think that leaves us with a critical lens through which to view our own modern environment. Think about the unseen foundations of our world. Every piece of infrastructure you take for granted. A smooth paved road cutting through an impossible mountain pass. A massive concrete dam holding back millions of gallons of water. A soaring suspension bridge, or even a scenic, peaceful rail trail through the woods. Has ghost stories baked into its concrete, its steel, and its soil.
The next time you are out enjoying a beautiful reclaimed space or driving over a massive bridge or complaining about being stuck in construction traffic, take a moment, look at the concrete, look at the earth that was forcefully moved, and ask yourself, whose names are missing from the dedication plaque?
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Uncharted Lancaster podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating or review wherever you listen. It really helps more people discover the show. For more fascinating local history, visit unchartedlancaster.com. And if you'd like to go deeper, check out one of Adam Zern's books at unchartedlancaster.com/books. Until next time, keep exploring.